Welcome to Pax Europiana here in front of this Belgrade sign, and I'm very happy to be here in this beautiful town and to talk about the history of Yugoslavia and about Yugo nostalgia and about the economic history of Yugoslavia. This is very important to understand. Here, by the way, is the central bank of Serbia now, and it is of course a very tragic economic history and also political history. It was an unlawful state and it was a dictatorship, a socialist dictatorship, and the history of that currency is actually quite the most tragic history of the currency ever. Now actually it is pegged about 117 to the euro, so since 10 years that's much better. And now the country is stable because it's economically in Europe. It's not mentally, strategically in Europe, but economically. And after such a long and tragic economic history, which is now a little bit political and a little bit I will talk about the currency and about all the connection between currency, economics and politics. There's a lot of ideas, you know, that Yugoslavia was stable in the 70s and 80s and good, you know, Yugoslavian experiments, freedom, social democracy, not a socialist dictatorship. But I want to explain that all this is connected with the Cold War. Yugoslavia was after 1948, when Tito and Stalin split. It turned, especially after 1951, when America took the fiscal responsibility for the Yugoslavian survival in the height of the Cold War. There was the Joint Chief of Staff Directive to fund Yugoslavia. And from that moment, indirectly, not fully integrated in the Marshall Plan or OECD, from this moment on, basically Yugoslavia turned to be a kind of a client state of America, more like a Latin American military dictatorship with socialist economic policy. It was a very confused system, but this was the reality of 1951 to 1985, more or less. Yeah? And here comes also the explanation for the breakup of Yugoslavia. It is all connected with the second re-election of Ronald Reagan. Because why? Because with American Cold War policy, this kind of containment policy, not the appeasement of the 70s, but the containment of Ronald Reagan, and then re-elected. Because let's not forget, the Cold War was at its maximum height again in 81 to 84. Because Ronald Reagan did Star Wars, the rearmament, the confrontation in Afghanistan, the funding of all the counterinsurgencies from Afghanistan to El Salvador, Nicaragua, etc., etc. So there was a big rollback and American power was big again. Then it was reconfirmed, and then the Soviets basically went for a draw. They elected the poorer guy, the more softer guy, Gorbachev, and from that moment on, for countries like Yugoslavia, which basically have been funded by America and the American allies, Germany, indirectly also by labor market access and by this kind of softer measures that you fund investment, you give market access, you give labor market access and American money via the international institutions or bilaterally and many other tools. Then you had basically this client state status from 51 to 85. And in 85 came the moment when, because of the Soviets going for a draw and having basically fiscally being in the complete crisis because of the oil glut which the Americans organized with the Saudi friends in order to end the Afghanistan catastrophe of the Soviets, then what happened then was the case for funding Yugoslavia was no longer there. And Yugoslavia was working because it had a lot of external funding and they had nothing to sell. You know, they had not little to sell. They had sold some power stations, some electrical equipment to Libya, to Cuba, to Iraq, to some socialist client states. They had, of course, a little bit of cheaper access and product markets via this block-free movement. But fundamentally they had nothing to sell for the huge cost of giving this unity alive and plastering over these huge ethnic, religious and cultural and political divisions, which they used of course violence, but not ultimate violence like in the Soviet Union. And that was, of course, because they had also the American ambassador always saying, no, you cannot cramp down on the Albanians, you cannot cramp down on the Croatians because you are our client state. Yeah? So they didn't have the resort to ultimate violence, because otherwise they would not have got money from America and Germany and all the West, of course, and labor market access, which was so vital to have employment and foreign exchange reserves. Yeah? So because they had nothing to sell. This area is very beautiful, but historically very poor. Southeastern Europe since centuries is exporting labor and nothing else, little else actually. Especially the Western Balkans is geographically not very advantaged. The Eastern Balkan has much more natural resources. But here we are in Belgrade, the capital of a broke union. All the time it was broke. Tito wanted to live the big life, and he did that for some many years. He lived like a Latin American gauchillo, and he had these global jamborees, and he was the hero of the bloc-free world, but obeyed by the Americans. Yeah? And he was dancing around. He got also money of the Soviets. Later then they were also trying to get, he was playing all sides off like a smart, neutral, in a way bloc-free, like some Austrians are dreaming and doing actually. Unfortunately, I always call Austria the northern Yugoslavia, Tito's real dream, because we are also behaving like this. It's very shabby behavior actually, immoral, yeah? And it's very bad. Yeah? But it worked some ways, but the buck stopped there when the American pulled the plug, because it was no longer necessary, because the Soviets were playing for peace with Gorbachev, and then the whole reason to fund this kind of Tito successor regime was no longer there. So the money was out. What to do? Of course, internal escalation. This is exactly the calculation of Milosevic and his elite and his clique. Yeah? They saw there is no money more. What to do? You have to play then the nationalistic card and play for violence. And from that moment on, he went then to Kosovo, went into this full escalation, the famous things, and then he took the power, and Stambolic was later killed, and all these things, his political mentor, because the union was broke and he knew exactly there was no money left, so he could only go on a big robbery in a way, stealing from the other republics and funding his own rise to power by manipulating the currency, hyperinflation, stealing from the various other republics who were fiscally more sound, and basically making a war of conquest in Kosovo, and also trying to dominate everybody, because the whole Tito-esque debt-funded unity was no longer with any kind of economic rationale because of the end of the Cold War. And obviously nobody was interested in their what the few things they had to sell in Yugoslavia. The bloc-free world joined more or less the free world, so why not buy real things from Germany and from America, where there are real power stations, and not to buy okayish power stations from Yugoslavia for political favors. Yeah? So there was basically nothing to sell anymore. There were no foreign exchange reserves, and then the currency collapsed in unbelievable, unprecedented manners. And then when the war came, it was anyhow hyperinflation. Because why? Nothing to sell, you can only print money, and that's what Milosevic did. He printed his money for his wars, and he made a war of conquest. His soldiers were stealing what they could, and he stole everything else what he could in terms of assets, everything, and he wanted to steal the land obviously as well for his greater Serbian project, because that's ultimately what it is. You steal the land of the other republics and entities, and then you make a war of conquest in Napoleon style, and your soldiers can get the things that people have privately in their households. That's very much what they did in Bosnia and in Kosovo, taking everything from the Croats, Bosnians and Albanians which they could, yeah? Because the dinar was worth nothing. They knew there was some valuables, household goods, or even money, or even some saved reserves in Kosovo and in Bosnia, and that's what they basically went on conquest, a kind of thief, how you call it, when you steal everything, a robbery, a big robbery. The ultimate reason for the breakup of Yugoslavia, let's not forget, was then also the determining moment, because the two big powers in Yugoslavia was the Serbs and the Croatians. And when in 1990, when Milosevic ordered the central bank to give a huge $1.5 billion loan towards the Serbian central bank in order to fund his broke union and take money basically from all 5.5 republics, whatever, the whole Yugoslavia, from the whole union, to transfer to the Serb National Bank. Basically, I guess it was the same building, so they stole from the union. And then this was the point where, you know, when you are a union, you have to watch for what is happening with the joint money. It's in all unions, in America, in this one, but this was a union based on unlawful dominance of the Serbs. And they took then this big 1.5 billion loan and basically stole in order to fund the public wages in the Serb Republic and also prepare for the war of conquest. And that was the moment the Croatians couldn't what to do. When one republic steals everything, then you have to make the point. And that was the breaking point of the Yugoslavian Union. And it's all very much connected to the Cold War, the end of the Cold War, basically with the Soviets playing for peace after the re-election of Ronald Reagan, because they knew the big skipper, he will outrun them and outperform them with his amazing American economic engine, and they knew that, and then they played for peace. They elected Gorbachev, and then the case for the subsidies for Yugoslavia was gone. And so it all went into spiraling economic decline, which ultimately led to war. That's a big tragedy, obviously. It might have been avoided, but as Milosevic was bent for war, it was no way to avoid it. And the Slovenian Croatians had run for cover, and luckily they were safe, and it came to this escalation in Bosnia and to the war, 3 years, tragedy, and Kosovo, because all of this. And now, basically, there's a reason why Bosnia has a euro-backed currency, Macedonia as well, and Montenegro and Kosovo have the euro. And because currency policy really is very much about the decency in governance and about integration into the EU, and that's why I call also for the euro for Serbia. But Serbia has to do the commitment to recognize Kosovo and to come to terms with its terrible past and let Kosovo and Bosnia join fully NATO in order to be safe from potential aggression, and also Serbia ultimately to join NATO as well. And all the turbulent post-World War II settlement, all this balancing act, which the buck stops here now. Serbia is now today still with Russia mentally, even when Russia is bombarding Mariupol and Kharkiv. I mean, this is unbelievable. And it is the point where all these things have to stop, and where Serbia has to come to terms with its past and adopt the euro for the recognition of Kosovo, and by that way also join the European economic system completely, which actually Serbia in the last 10 years has already in many regulatory and financial and economic terms. But Vučić was never ready to fully join the West mentally. He always played this hair of Tito role by playing off the West against Russia and both sides, and there is no way this can continue under the bombs of Mariupol and this terror regime which Putin has now turned into. If Vučić opts for that, he is out, he must be out, and we must have a European Serbia. That is absolutely now necessary. Good, that's my short message about currency history here at the place of the central bank and Belgrade. It's a wonderful place. I'm very optimistic for its future, and I call for European Serbia to adopt the euro, recognize Kosovo, join Ukraine and send weapons to Ukraine, please, and be a good European member state in the future, and join NATO. Absolutely, it's important as well. Thanks a lot here from Belgrade, and no dreams please about Yugo nostalgia. It was always a terror regime from 45, 44 to 51, absolute terror. It has been under American tutelage a bit softer and a bit more open, but it was ever an unlawful regime, and no nostalgia for such a regime, please. Thanks a lot. Bye.